When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped into a high-stakes Capitol Hill hearing, she came face-to-face with Larry Elder, a man who had built his platform by denying systemic racism and calling Black Lives Matter a fraud. But Jasmine didn't flinch. With calm precision, she dropped undeniable facts, a buried police report, and a viral clip that exposed the cracks in Elder's entire persona. Within days, his campaign crumbled, donors fled, and his name became political poison. When a man profits from denying his community's pain, what happens when that pain finally speaks back? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. At exactly 9 a.m., room 2268 of the Rayburn House office building locked into silence as the cameras went live. The title above the chair read, "The Influence of Minority Media, Truth or Division." But everyone in the room knew this hearing was no ordinary policy debate. It was a showdown. The room was packed wall to wall, reporters shoulder to shoulder, congressional aides frozen behind their tablets, and students gripping their pens like weapons. This wasn't just about media, it was about who controls the story of race in America and who gets erased from it. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered quietly through the left wing, dressed in a deep navy suit that made no attempt to soften her presence. She nodded once to the chairwoman, once to the crowd, then took her seat at the witness table without a word. Her hands were steady, her jaw locked. Across from her, already seated and adjusting his silk tie, was Larry Elder, broad smile, clean-shaven, and radiating the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how to dominate a camera lens. He didn't stand to greet her. He simply smirked. In that instant, the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Two Black public figures, two radically different ideologies, now locked in the same frame. This wasn't just testimony. This was a televised confrontation decades in the making. Larry had come to defend the conservative belief that racism was no longer the defining obstacle for Black Americans. Jasmine had come to confront that very delusion and the systems that allowed it to flourish. The tension wasn't spoken, but it screamed from every glance, every breath. Staffers looked away. Even the chairman hesitated before calling the session to order. The stakes were no longer theoretical. This was personal, ancestral, and explosive. And as both figures adjusted their microphones, a singular question seemed to rise, unspoken but deafening in every mind present. Who truly speaks for Black America today, and who is trying to silence her? The silence that followed Jasmine's entrance had been dense, alive almost, but now it was shattered by the distinct, practiced cadence of Larry Elder. The chairman barely had time to announce the speaker before Elder leaned into the microphone. Shoulders relaxed like he'd done this 100 times before. But there was no warmth in his tone, no casual preamble, no thank you for the invitation, just impact. He came not to testify, but to declare. And he opened not with his own words, but with those of the man whose worldview had shaped much of his rhetoric, Thomas Sowell. As Thomas Sowell once said, Elder began, voice even, clipped, "Racism is not dead, but it is on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and those who feel superior by labeling others as racists." The words rang out like a courtroom verdict, not an opinion. There was no room for nuance, no space for pain, just an accusation wrapped in academic authority. On the right side of the room, a few nods, measured, almost grateful. On the left, stillness. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her stillness was different, not passive, coiled. Larry paused, not to breathe, but to measure the discomfort, to let the quote hang in the air like smoke. Then he folded his hands in front of him and moved to the next blow, delivered as if it were a simple truth, long overdue. "The real danger," he said, "is not oppression. It's obsession. This country is not failing Black Americans. Our culture is." There it was, the pivot, from racism as system to culture as scapegoat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was a man who had mastered the art of making calm sound like truth. Without naming Jasmine, he turned slightly toward her, just enough for the message to be personal, but not confrontational. It was the kind of rhetorical control that made people believe he was reasonable even when he was erasing lives. Take affirmative action, he continued, sold as justice, but in practice, a backhanded insult, a message that we are not good enough to earn our place without a head start. He spoke like a professor correcting a lie in a student essay, cold, exact, patient. It teaches our children that their future is a favor, not a result of their effort. That pity is progress. There was no outburst, no gasps, just the uneasy tension of moral clarity turned upside down. It was sharp, surgical, rehearsed, and dangerous in its elegance. Elder's words didn't aim to provoke emotion, they aimed to invalidate it. He wasn't just challenging Jasmine, he was undermining the very legitimacy of the struggle she represented by painting it as a narrative of dependency, not dignity. But Elder wasn't finished, not when the room was still holding its breath, not when the cameras were still rolling. What had begun as a carefully constructed critique was now turning into a full-scale ideological assault. And this time, the target was unmistakable. He leaned in again, slower, more deliberate, with the self-assurance of a man who believed the most controversial words he was about to say would also be his most applauded. The calmness in his delivery wasn't restraint, it was strategy. He wasn't there to shout, he was there to reframe the battlefield. Black Lives Matter is a fraud. He said it without blinking. The sentence didn't need embellishment. It was a shot fired with deadly precision. No metaphor, no softening. In the crowd, there was a slight rustle, like wind hitting glass. Some turned to one another. A few aides dropped their pens. But Elder didn't pause to watch the impact. He pressed forward, already moving into the heart of his indictment. It is not a movement for progress. It is a movement that glorifies grievance. It teaches young black men to look outward, to blame, to rage, not to rise. He spoke slowly now, each phrase carved like a stone etched into marble. It was the kind of argument that sounded reasonable to those who never felt the heat of a police spotlight, the cold steel of a denied loan, the suffocation of being followed in a store you could afford. Elder's tone was clean, but his message wasn't. It reduced an entire generation's pain into performance, stripped a grassroots movement of context, and rebranded righteous anger as victim mentality. Then came the pivot, the moment when rhetoric became weapon. The problem, he said slowly, is not skin color. The problem is dependency. The problem is not the system, it's the collapse of the family. And people like Congresswoman Crockett, he added, his smile thin and calculated, have built entire political careers selling the pain of our people. The words were sharper than before, honed not to spark outrage but to plant doubt. He didn't yell, he didn't sneer. He simply recited a narrative that had been polished across decades of right-wing talk radio and conservative op-eds, delivered now in a room filled with both power and pain. His attack was designed to look like clarity, but it was a dismissal dressed as analysis, a betrayal of truth disguised as principle. For a full 10 seconds after Elder's final blow, the hearing chamber remained frozen. No shuffling papers, no whispered comments, not even the click of a retracting pen. It was the kind of silence that doesn't settle but tightens, the kind that demands someone speak, not out of anger, but out of necessity. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. They waited for her to retaliate, for a scathing remark, for a clapback that would trend within minutes. But she didn't give them what they expected. She gave them what they needed. Jasmine leaned forward with a calmness that looked like grace, but felt like gravity. She didn't touch the mic. She touched the truth. With quiet precision, she opened a single manila folder before her. Not dramatic, not rushed. This wasn't theater. It was testimony. She took a breath, scanned the first page, then spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry. Steady, focused, grounded in fact. Black applicants are 80% more likely to be denied a mortgage than white applicants with the same income. She didn't embellish. She didn't look up for effect. She let the number do the talking. There were no charts, no graphics, just her voice and a mountain of unspoken history behind each syllable. She turned to the next page like a surgeon preparing for the next incision. Black mothers are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than white mothers, regardless of education level. The words didn't land with a thud. They cut, clean, clinical, a truth so uncomfortable it silenced even the usual skeptics. Jasmine's eyes never wavered. She wasn't just addressing the room, she was addressing the pattern. Black drivers are more likely to be stopped, searched, and detained during traffic stops, even when no violation is present. She paused, just long enough for the statistic to land, but not long enough for it to be dismissed. There was no drama in her delivery, only clarity. She flipped the page again. In education, black students receive harsher discipline than white students for the same infractions. The room had gone utterly still. Jasmine's voice was neither sharp nor soft. It was deliberate. Every number, a ledger of lives unseen. Every line, a wound no one had stitched. She turned to the final page. And in employment, resumes with black-sounding names get fewer callbacks than identical ones with white-sounding names. Then she closed the folder with both hands, slowly, like a reverend closing scripture. Not to end the sermon, but to demand reflection. She finally looked up, not to provoke Elder, not to win the moment, but to face the denial in the room with the dignity of the truth itself. Her expression was calm, her silence afterward, louder than any applause. Because what she had just laid out was an opinion, it was a pattern, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The final page settled back into the folder with the quiet weight of a closing file. But Jasmine didn't move right away. The room was still, not out of respect, but because something deeper had shifted. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't called names. Yet every line she read had landed with more force than any outburst. Still seated, still composed, she leaned slightly into the microphone, not to escalate, but to reveal. What came next wasn't a rebuttal. It was a reminder. Her voice was steady, low, and unwavering. The freedom you speak of is not the reality for those who are just trying to survive every day. There was no anger in her tone, only precision, the kind born from lived experience. Her words didn't just respond to Elder's rhetoric, they dismantled its foundation. She paused only briefly, her eyes sweeping the chamber not with defiance, but with something far more dangerous to a comfortable lie. Clarity. You could feel it. Every law clerk, every reporter, every staffer sitting up straighter, listening harder, because this wasn't political performance. This was personal history, spoken as fact. Freedom is not the success story of a single individual. It is how the system treats an entire community. She let the words breathe. No rush, no apology, just the truth, laid bare like a wound no one could ignore. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't arguing with Larry Elder. She was pulling back the curtain on a country that still believed merit could erase injustice. And she wasn't just speaking to the room. She was speaking to everyone watching who had ever been told that their pain was self-inflicted. She gave no theatrics. She gave America its reflection, and suddenly even the silence had something to answer for. But Elder wasn't looking for a policy debate. He was looking for a moment, and Jasmine's clarity had just given him one to twist. As the echo of her final words drifted into silence, he leaned back, folding his hands in that practiced way that made confrontation look like casual thought. But the tightness around his eyes betrayed something colder. Calculation. He was done speaking about systems and statistics. Now he wanted to speak about her. He shifted forward, lips parted in a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. The room had settled into stillness again, that electric tension that falls just before someone decides to go for blood. She talks about systems, he said, voice smooth, almost amused. But what she really sells is sorrow. The line hit like a slap across velvet, polished, controlled, and deeply personal. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he diminished. Every syllable framed Jasmine not as a legislator, not even as a critic, but as an opportunist, a performer, someone who saw trauma as currency. A few heads turned, some scribbled notes faster, others froze, as if unsure whether to lean in or look away. Congresswoman Crockett, he continued, measured and deliberate, is not here to solve problems. She's here to package them. She builds a brand on brokenness, a platform on pain. She doesn't mend, she markets. The words were elegant in structure, brutal in intent. He spoke them with the certainty of someone who knew his audience, or thought he did. He knew that in Washington, calling someone emotional is often more damaging than calling them wrong. And in a country that still punishes vulnerability, accusing a black woman of monetizing pain was a precision strike meant to leave no visible scar, only doubt. And then he leaned in for the finish. Not louder, not sharper, but colder. You don't fix division by talking about it every day. You feed it. You double it. And that's what you do, Congresswoman. You don't resolve the wound. You reopen it to stay in power. He sat back slowly, as if the matter were settled, as if the case had been closed. But he hadn't closed anything. He'd reopened something far more dangerous than political disagreement. He'd attacked the right to name pain, the courage to confront injustice, and the integrity of someone who had lived through what he preferred to debate. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't tighten her jaw. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she moved with the calm of someone who had long since learned that silence, when chosen with intent, is its own form of power. Without responding to the insult directly, she turned slightly to the chairman, her tone composed but unmistakably firm. "Can we play the clip?" she asked, her voice low but commanding, as if what came next wasn't retaliation, but revelation. The chairman gave a small nod. The room darkened just enough for the screen at the front to become the sole focus of every eye in the chamber. The screen lit up with a bright flash of white, then faded into the familiar branding of Fox Nation. Clean, polished, proud. The timestamp, April 2021, flickered in the corner, followed by the unmistakable voice of Larry Elder. There he was, seated comfortably in a studio chair, smiling with the ease of someone surrounded by approval. His body language was relaxed. His hands moved as if conducting a private joke with the host. Then came the moment, the sentence, spoken not in rage, but with a shrug, with ease, with no awareness of the weight behind it, or worse, complete awareness. If we're going to talk about reparations, maybe slave owners deserve some too. It didn't explode. It sank, heavy, slow, sickening. The words poured from the speakers and dropped like a lead curtain across the room. There was no immediate reaction, only the kind of stunned, involuntary stillness that overtakes a crowd when the mask is pulled all the way off. One staffer near the back looked down at her tablet, as if unsure whether to keep watching. A younger congressional aide's pen slipped from his hand. A senator to Jasmine's left exhaled sharply through her nose, lips pressed into a tight line. Even among those who had applauded Elder minutes earlier, something shifted, visibly, silently. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She wasn't watching the video for the first time. She had seen it, lived the thinking behind it, endured the quiet, polished cruelty that dressed itself in intellect and called it balance. What mattered now was not her reaction, but the room's, the country's. She sat motionless as the screen faded to black, her hands folded before her like a witness to a crime she could finally prove. Because what Elder had just called marketing pain was now exposed for what it really was, the comfortable denial of generational violence, repackaged as casual commentary. He had dismissed history in a sentence, and now that sentence had come back, not just as evidence, but as indictment. And in the silence that followed, it became clear. This wasn't about a political disagreement. It was about the cost of telling the truth in a room that was never designed to hear it. The screen faded to black, but the silence it left behind stayed, thick, motionless, suffocating. Larry Elder shifted slightly in his seat, the flicker of discomfort finally visible at the corner of his eyes. The once confident posture had tightened, if only by a fraction. Jasmine saw it, so did the room. But she didn't press the moment with a smirk or a triumphant glance. She didn't need to, because she wasn't finished. What had just been shown on screen was not the climax, it was the opening crack. And now she was ready to drive the wedge deeper. Without a word, she reached forward, pulled a thick manila folder from her briefcase and placed it on the table in front of her, with a calm that made the gesture feel louder than any voice. Her fingers moved precisely, not rushed, not theatrical, just certain. Like someone unsealing a record that had waited years to be acknowledged. The room, already breathless, somehow grew quieter. Even the clicking keyboards in the press row had stopped. She opened the folder, revealing a police report clipped neatly to the top. The seal of the Los Angeles Police Department was faintly visible in the upper left corner. She turned a page, then another, and then looked up. Not at Elder, but directly ahead. Her voice came steady, controlled, but what she said next was a bomb wrapped in calm. "This is a police report," she began, "filed in 2015. The words alone didn't land. Not yet. But the tension in the room shifted again, tightening like a drawstring pulled slow and deliberate. It was submitted by a woman who was in a domestic relationship with Mr. Elder at the time. Her statement describes an argument. Her statement also describes Mr. Elder retrieving a firearm and pointing it at her. There was no gasp this time. No one dared. The air had become electric, paralyzed. The accusation wasn't being shouted. It was being read, quietly like a legal record. Because it was. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't editorialize. She let the weight of the documentation speak for itself. Let it spread across the chamber like ink soaking into paper. Elder's hands, once folded confidently before him, now gripped the edge of the table. Barely, but enough. Still, Jasmine didn't call him a criminal. She didn't demand outrage or cast judgment. That wasn't her aim. Her goal was much harder to refute, much more dangerous to those who trade in moral absolutes. She looked up again, and this time, her gaze met his. Not in triumph, but in challenge. Her voice dropped just slightly, softer than before, but sharp enough to cut the silence in two. "When you speak of family values," she asked, her tone measured, "are we willing to speak honestly about power and control inside the very home you claim to protect?" The question didn't ring out. It settled like ash. Slowly, painfully, unavoidably. No one moved. Even the most partisan listeners in the room seemed momentarily unmoored. Because Jasmine hadn't merely thrown a stone, she'd opened a door. One that forced the entire room to look inward and ask itself what it had been too polite, too political, too complicit to confront. Elder didn't answer. He didn't even blink. But his jaw clenched slightly, and for the first time since the hearing began, the confidence he wore like armor no longer fit. He shifted again in his seat, not to posture, but to retreat. Subtly, quietly, as if trying not to betray the crack beneath his polished tone. The chairman didn't interrupt. The aides didn't whisper. The press didn't dare type. It was as if the entire hearing had folded in on itself, holding its breath in fear of what might follow. Jasmine remained motionless. She didn't press, didn't gloat, because she knew this wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. And truth, when presented plainly, doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs to be heard. The seconds ticked by, and still Elder said nothing. Not because he didn't have words, but because none of them would protect him from what had just been laid bare. Not to the room, not to the nation, and most damning of all, not to himself. The silence inside the hearing chamber was deafening, but outside those walls the world was anything but quiet. What had happened in room 2268, Jasmine's calm delivery, the footage, the police report, and that one devastating question had already exploded beyond the marble columns of Capitol Hill. It hadn't even been an hour, but that's all it took. The moment the clip of Elder suggesting slave owners deserve reparations hit the internet, it detonated like a slow-motion bomb across every major platform. By the time the hearing reached its midday recess, the hashtags had taken over. Elder Lomat, Masha Crockett vs. Elder. Chani, who speaks for us? They weren't just trending, they were roaring. On TikTok, clips of Jasmine's calm stare as Elder squirmed were set to audio like gospel sermons and protest anthems. On Twitter, journalists scrambled to confirm the 2015 police report, only to find it had been buried in court archives, never litigated, never followed up. Now it was everywhere. CNN pushed a breaking Chiron. 2015 police report raises questions about Elder's past conduct. MSNBC rolled a split screen between Jasmine's quote and Elder's Fox Nation clip. Even conservative-leaning outlets couldn't ignore it. The footage was too clean, the soundbite too damning, There was no way to edit around what had just unfolded live. And then came the avalanche. Within 45 minutes of the hearing's peak moment, the Women for Accountability PAC released a joint statement calling for the immediate reopening of the 2015 domestic violence investigation involving Elder. The statement was shared by 12 different organizations, including the National Black Women's Roundtable, Mothers Against Political Violence, and Survivor Voices United. They weren't asking politely, they were demanding. Simultaneously, screenshots began surfacing of Elder's older interviews, clips and quotes buried deep in the archives but now pulled to the surface like corpses in a rising flood. One video showed him saying, with unnerving ease, "Women are less politically informed than men. That's not opinion, it's data." In another, he shrugged on a talk show couch and declared, "Systemic racism? It's just a hustle, an industry, a lie people like Jasmine Crockett sell to stay relevant." Each resurfaced moment was time-stamped, verified, shared thousands of times in minutes. And with each viral hit, the myth of Larry Elder as a dignified conservative voice began to collapse, publicly, irrevocably. Then came the first fracture from within. The Langston Group, a prominent hedge fund that had previously donated over $500,000 to Elder's exploratory campaign for California governor, issued a two-line press release. "Effective immediately, we are withdrawing all financial support from Mr. Elder's political operations. We condemn the values recently brought to light." That statement spread faster than the original video. Not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what many had suspected. The power behind Elder was never personal. It was conditional, marketable, and now it was gone. As the afternoon wore on, the backlash shifted from viral to institutional. Prominent law professors, political ethicists, and even former Republican strategists began chiming in. Elder's defense of slaveholders wasn't just offensive. It was politically suicidal. His remarks about women weren't just outdated, they were dangerous. His denial of systemic racism in the context of a live, documented congressional hearing felt less like opinion and more like contempt for lived reality. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She hadn't posted. She hadn't spoken to the press. Her team hadn't issued a single tweet, because the power of her moment wasn't in the spin, it was in the substance. She hadn't needed to trend. She had spoken clearly, calmly, with facts and control. And now the world was doing what truth does when it can't be silenced. It multiplied. Meanwhile, Elder's team scrambled. Sources close to the campaign told reporters that internal meetings were chaotic and panicked. One aide reportedly quit before the day was over. Others were instructed to begin reviewing all public footage from the past 10 years. But it was too late. The internet was doing the archiving for them, clip by clip, word by word, frame by frame. No scandal lives in isolation anymore. And this one was moving fast, far faster than Elder's team had prepared for. What began as a calculated attempt to corner Jasmine Crockett in front of the nation had become something far more dangerous to the man who initiated it, a public reckoning. A moment when decades of curated rhetoric crashed against the unyielding force of evidence, memory, and a woman who refused to be diminished. And so, as the sun began to dip across the Capitol dome, the question on every screen was no longer, did Jasmine Crockett go too far? But how long can Larry Elder last? Because in the court of public opinion, where millions now watched, replayed, and judged, not all silence is survival. Sometimes it's the beginning of collapse. The momentum outside the chamber had become impossible to ignore. Reporters were clustering in the hallways. Phones lit up with alerts from every major network. Elder's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. And the walls of the hearing room, once thick with ideological defiance, now pulsed with something colder. Consequence. He must have felt it. The unraveling. The shift. Because just as the chairman called for a brief recess, Larry Elder rose slowly from his seat. No longer defiant, just cornered. His fingers moved to the mic clipped to his lapel, and with a single deliberate tug, he removed it and placed it gently on the table, like a weapon laid down in surrender. But then came the last act, the one move left in his arsenal, The performance of victimhood disguised as principle. He straightened his jacket, turned toward the audience, and raised his voice just enough for every corner of the chamber to hear, not with fury, but with forced moral outrage. "This is not a hearing," he declared. "This is a public show trial masquerading as justice." His words echoed like a closing gavel, not from a judge, but from a man trying to reclaim control over a narrative slipping through his fingers. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was strained. People looked down. Some folded their arms. Others didn't react at all. But a few, those loyal, unflinching allies from his party, stood up behind him. Not many, but enough to make a scene. One by one, a small cluster of hardline Republicans rose from their chairs and walked out behind him, heads high, steps stiff, pretending dignity where there was only deflection. The click of their heels against the marble floor became the only sound in the room. No applause, no jeers, just the quiet procession of men and women refusing accountability and cloaking it in principle. Elder reached the exit without a single glance back, but the power had already shifted. At the table, Jasmine Crockett remained seated, still as stone. She hadn't spoken since presenting the police report. She didn't need to. But now, with the stage vacated by those who couldn't face what had been said, what had been shown, she reached for the mic, slow and intentional, not to strike back, but to name the moment for what it was. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "If running from accountability is what we now call leadership," she said quietly, "then I'm proud not to be one." The line didn't erupt like a cheer. It dropped like a gavel. Precise. Final. The kind of sentence that doesn't chase applause but earns silence. The kind of sentence that closes a chapter. Clean, unflinching, unforgettable. Jasmine didn't look toward the door. She looked forward, because she wasn't here to follow the theatrics of those who walked out. She was here to stay, to speak, to face the room that remained. And in that moment, under the harsh white lights and the weight of a nation watching, leadership didn't walk out the door. It stayed at the table, and it spoke the truth. The final syllables of Jasmine's words still echoed in the nation's conscience when the tremors began to register as aftershocks, real, tangible consequences. It didn't take days. It didn't even take 24 hours. Within 8 hours of Elder's exit from the hearing, formal petitions were already being submitted to reopen the 2015 domestic violence report he thought the public had forgotten. But this time, it wasn't a lone voice calling for justice. It was a wave. The National Bar Alliance, California Legal Women's Fund, and Justice Renewal Initiative filed joint motions urging the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office to conduct a review not just of the case itself, but of why it was never pursued in the first place. They didn't just want answers. They wanted a reckoning. The pressure spread fast. What had begun as a political moment had metastasized into a legal storm. By noon the next day, the California State Ethics Committee issued an emergency statement confirming it would open a review into Larry Elder's fitness to run for public office. The language was restrained, measured, bureaucratic, but the implication was radioactive. If they found credible cause, Elder could be barred from appearing on the gubernatorial ballot. For a man who had spent years branding himself as the antidote to liberal California, this wasn't just a reputational wound. It was a direct threat to his political survival. And then Elder struck back. Late that evening, under dim studio lighting and with American flags flanking both shoulders, Elder appeared in a 6-minute video uploaded across all his social platforms. The tone was familiar. Part preacher, part pundit, part martyr. He didn't mention Jasmine by name. He didn't need to. His script was loaded with every coded phrase his base had come to expect. "What we are witnessing," he said, staring straight into the camera, "is not justice. It's not accountability. It's a left-wing takedown, orchestrated by media elites and woke radicals who fear the truth I speak." He paused dramatically, narrowing his eyes as if peering through the lens and into the hearts of his enemies. "They couldn't debate me, so now they want to erase me." He called the hearing a show trial, echoed his earlier exit speech, and warned his followers that, if they can come for me, they'll come for you next. The video was designed to spark rage, to reignite loyalty. But it didn't, because something had shifted. The comments were different this time. Not just the trolls and bots or the loyal few. This time, the doubt had crept into his own echo chamber. Dozens of replies began with, "I used to respect you, but," or, "This isn't the man I thought you were." Others were more direct. "So pointing a gun at a woman is media spin now?" Or, "You said slave owners deserved reparations." That wasn't taken out of context. You meant it. The video didn't go viral. It didn't trend. It sunk. Major donors began to distance themselves, quietly at first, then with carefully worded press releases. The Orange County Business Roundtable, one of the most prominent Republican funding circles in Southern California, announced it would be withdrawing all pending contributions to Elder's campaign and redirecting resources toward candidates who promote unity, not division. That line hit hard, not because it was harsh, but because it came from inside the fortress. Meanwhile, late-night shows had a field day. Satirical news segments juxtaposed Elder's denial video with his past clips, each contradiction hitting like a drumbeat of hypocrisy. But it wasn't just comedy. It was cultural condemnation, the kind that reaches beyond politics into the bloodstream of the national psyche. The man who once styled himself as the bold voice of common sense now looked cornered, desperate, and painfully out of touch. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't smile for the cameras. Because her point had never been to destroy a man. It had been to reveal a system. Elder's collapse wasn't her victory. It was a mirror held up to a country that had long confused power with virtue and performance with truth. Inside Elder's inner circle, panic set in. Campaign staff began defecting. The political consultants, who once bragged about his immunity to scandal, now whispered about exit strategies. Some even suggested issuing an apology. But Elder refused. To apologize would be to admit that Crockett had won. And that he could not stomach. But the public didn't wait for contrition. Public opinion polls, once comfortably in Elder's favor among conservative and swing voters, began to nosedive. Within 72 hours, a poll conducted by Sacramento Register showed his favorability had dropped 31 points among independents. Even among Republican women, the support that once propped up his outsider brand began to falter. The hashtags hadn't gone away. They had become slogans printed on signs used in student rallies, echoed in town halls across the state. Crockett and Elder truth does not flinch. Power is not immunity. The headlines were relentless. Elder faces reopened inquiry amid mounting pressure. Ethics panel reviews gubernatorial eligibility. Can Larry survive this? And the answer, increasingly, was no. Because when a man builds his legacy on the illusion of invincibility, all it takes is one voice armed with truth to bring the whole facade down. And now that voice had spoken. The nation had listened, and the man who once claimed to speak for forgotten Americans now stood utterly alone, struggling to be heard over the roar of his own undoing. The fallout had reached critical mass. Elder's silence had become a shadow trailing him across every outlet, every feed, every political room he once commanded. The headlines were no longer about allegations. They were about abandonment. His empire was bleeding. But while he withdrew into carefully lit studios and pre-written statements, Jasmine Crockett stepped out into the sunlight, not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to reclaim the ground on which this entire reckoning had been fought. The location was simple, a small stone plaza just outside the Capitol, the kind of place where reporters gathered with more tension than space. No red carpets, no podium banners, just a wooden lectern, a few quiet aides behind her, and over a dozen microphones lined up like waiting mouths. It was mid-morning. The air was sharp, and every network camera was already live. The crowd was hushed, expectant, some waiting for a political victory lap, others for a mistake. But Jasmine gave them neither. She stepped up to the mic with the same calm she had carried through the hearing, not cold, but composed, not triumphant, but unshaken. She looked at the rows of flashing lenses, the columns of journalists scribbling, the sea of faces that had watched her stand alone against one of the most unapologetically powerful black conservative figures in America. And then, after a brief pause, she spoke. "I did not come here to humiliate a black man." Her voice was quiet, even, measured, but the sentence stopped the world. "I came here to remind us that when a person of color stands before the nation and denies the pain of their own people, and we remain silent, we are complicit in that betrayal." A gasp didn't follow. It didn't need to. The power of the words wasn't in their volume. It was in their honesty, in their naked, unflinching confrontation of a sickness too many had learned to ignore for the sake of appearances. Jasmine didn't gesture wildly. She didn't shout. She stood still, hands clasped, gaze steady, letting each word drop like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward with every second. She spoke of what it meant to survive systems that pretend not to exist, of how the most dangerous voices are not always the loudest racists, but those who wear the language of respect while using it to invalidate truth. She explained why silence is not neutrality, why professionalism can't excuse complicity, why real leadership begins where comfort ends. This wasn't about Larry Elder, she said, pausing just long enough to let his name hang, then fall. It was about the stories that don't make headlines, about the women who are never believed, the sons who are stopped, the fathers who die nameless, the data we cite, the pain we carry, the reality we live, being treated as exaggeration unless it screamed. One reporter lowered his pen, another took off her glasses. No one interrupted, because what was happening now wasn't a political speech. It was a truth reckoning, raw and urgent, disguised in the posture of a press conference. Jasmine continued. She spoke of generations erased from civic memory, of history edited to serve comfort, of how internalized denial was the most polished weapon of systemic oppression. She did not beg to be understood. She simply made it impossible to deny what was plain. We can't afford to pretend anymore. Not for decorum, not for legacy, and certainly not for the illusion that we're making progress just because one of us has a microphone. The wind stirred slightly through the plaza. Her papers fluttered, but her voice never wavered. She didn't have notes, only conviction. And as she neared the end, there was no crescendo, no chant, no rallying cry, just one final statement, simple and searing. "If standing alone means I stand in truth, I will keep standing. And if that truth makes people uncomfortable, then let the discomfort do its work." With that, she stepped back from the mic, gave a single nod to the crowd, and walked away. No smile, no wave, no press follow-up. Her aides moved with quiet efficiency, leaving the cameras to focus on the echo of her words, not the sound of her footsteps. It was a masterclass in restraint, in moral authority, in knowing exactly when to speak and when to let silence thunder louder than applause. The next morning, front pages across the country bore the same headline in slightly different fonts. Some said, "Crockett speaks truth to power." Others read, "Crockett, silence is betrayal." But one stood out above the rest. In bold black lettering across the top of the Washington Post, "I did not come to humiliate a black man. I came to stop a lie." Below it, her full quote was printed, uncut. No edits, no framing, just the words as they were spoken. And below that, a question, written not by Jasmine, but by the columnist tasked with covering her. If this is not what leadership looks like, then what is? And for the first time in a long time, no one had an answer strong enough to drown her out. The echo of Jasmine's press conference hadn't faded. It had only begun to spread, not in sound, but in consequence. If her words inside the Capitol had cracked open the room, her words outside it cracked open the country. What started as a confrontation with one man had become a confrontation with a question far larger, far older, and far more uncomfortable. Who gets to speak for the oppressed, and who decides when the conversation is over? Across the nation, institutions began to stir, not just in politics, but in pulpits, classrooms, and television studios. This was no longer about Larry Elder. This was about America's need to believe that if a person of color succeeds, then the system must be fair. Universities were the first to move. Within 48 hours, over a dozen of the most respected institutions, Howard, UCLA, Morehouse, Princeton, Spelman, Stanford, and NYU among them, announced emergency panels, roundtables, and open forums titled not with Elder's name, but with far harder titles, When Success Masks Injustice, The Myth of Post-Racial Merit, Black Faces, White Narratives. Philosophy departments partnered with law schools, business students joined sociology chairs, lecture halls overflowed. Students stood in line for hours to ask questions, to challenge each other, to challenge themselves. In one standing room only forum at Harvard Law, a young black student stood up with tears in her eyes and asked, "If I get into this room but have to agree racism is dead to stay here, then what exactly did I earn?" The audience didn't applaud. They exhaled, because the line pierced deeper than a point. It uncovered a truth. In America, for the marginalized, success often comes with the price of silence, and Jasmine Crockett had refused to pay it. Churches followed, not just black churches, but white, Latino, immigrant, and interfaith communities. Sermons echoed with uncomfortable clarity. Pastors stopped mid-sermon to acknowledge the contradiction many had ignored for years, that some of the most polished voices in the public square are rewarded not for telling the truth, but for making it easier to ignore. In Baptist sanctuaries in Georgia, elders stood beside teenage activists and asked, "What does redemption mean when we still reward denial?" Congregations wept. Others nodded. Some sat in stillness because words no longer held shape around the guilt. Meanwhile, talk shows, normally reserved for light banter and celebrity feuds, shifted tone. Producers reached out to professors, trauma specialists, survivors of police violence, black historians. Viewers tuned in expecting controversy, and instead were handed a mirror. On one primetime segment, a host asked, "Does individual success give someone the right to invalidate systemic pain?" A panelist replied, flatly, "If it does, then we have replaced justice with branding." But it wasn't just the public figures who spoke now. It was the people watching. Teachers, bus drivers, mothers, soldiers, students. One letter stood out among the thousands that arrived at Jasmine Crockett's office that week. It came from a third-year student at Jackson State University. The handwriting was uneven, written on ruled notebook paper with the corner torn from a binder. There were no hashtags, no slogans, just a message that felt like it came from the soul of the country itself. You didn't just expose a man. You opened a wound this country pretended had already healed. We didn't need more debates. We needed someone brave enough to stop pretending. The letter was placed on Jasmine's desk by a staffer who had been crying when she read it. Jasmine didn't read it right away. She waited until her office was empty, the hallway quiet, the press long gone. She opened the letter slowly, sat back in her chair, and let the words settle in her chest like truth she had always known, but never expected to hear said back to her. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't applause. It was recognition. And that, more than headlines, more than polls, more than any political victory, was the thing that reminded her why she had done what she did. Not to win, not to destroy, but to tell the truth in a place that punishes it. In the weeks that followed, even as political strategists scrambled to reposition, even as elders' defenders tried to reframe the hearing as a media ambush, the questions Jasmine had forced into the spotlight refused to disappear. Does rising above the system mean the system worked, or that you survived it? Do polished success stories excuse the millions still silenced beneath them? Is representation real if it only reflects what those in power want to hear? And in every forum, every pew, every living room debate, one question kept rising above the noise. Raw, electric, unresolved. Who speaks for us? And in that silence, more voices began to rise. Not as replacements, but as answers. It didn't explode all at once. It spread, slowly, precisely, and with a force that no news cycle could contain. What Jasmine Crockett unleashed wasn't just a moment of political reckoning. It was a cultural shift, a tectonic adjustment in the way America spoke about race, power, and truth. It started with voices, not loud ones, not famous ones, but voices that had waited far too long to be heard. In a small classroom in Oakland, a high school senior stood up during a civics presentation and said, "I'm tired of being told the system isn't broken just because someone managed to climb out of it." The room fell silent, not because she was wrong, but because no one had ever dared say it so clearly. In Baltimore, a city bus driver wrote, "We see you, Jasmine," in sidewalk chalk outside a polling station. It lasted 3 days before it rained, but by then, the photo had gone viral. In Milwaukee, during a heated town hall, a single black father stood and said, "I'm not asking for anyone to carry my pain. I'm asking you to stop denying it exists." He sat down. The room didn't clap. They listened. What began as isolated echoes soon converged into something larger, a movement without a name, without a logo, but with momentum. From Denver to Atlanta, from inner-city classrooms to rural union halls, the same questions were being asked. Who gets to speak for us? And at what cost? Universities across the country responded first. Within 72 hours, nearly 24 top-tier institutions, Howard, Princeton, Morehouse, UCLA, Stanford, and Spelman among them, launched emergency symposiums. They weren't organized around Elder's name. They were built around the fracture he represented. Titles of forums read like indictments. When representation becomes a mask, success versus solidarity, and the weaponization of identity. Lecture halls filled. Overflow rooms filled faster. Students stood in doorways just to hear someone say what they'd known all along, that not every voice that looks like us speaks for us. In one packed auditorium at Columbia University, a law professor placed a single exam question on the final test. Compare and contrast performative representation and moral accountability. Use the Crockett Elder confrontation as your framework. Students didn't just answer it. They wrote essays like declarations. Some cried while typing. In Atlanta, a Baptist pastor opened his Sunday sermon with 10 seconds of silence, followed by one sentence. To speak comfort without acknowledging pain is to preach to ghosts. Congregants wept. No choir, no pageantry, just truth. Churches, black and white, Catholic and Unitarian, joined the discourse. In Houston, a coalition of interfaith leaders rewrote their annual statement on justice to include a single line. Success in the house of injustice is not freedom, it's captivity with privileges. Talk shows shifted overnight. On The View, on The Daily Show, on Real Time, hosts didn't talk about Elder's downfall. They asked deeper questions. Does personal achievement cancel out collective trauma? If you rise within a rigged system, do you owe it silence or truth? Can blackness be weaponized to undermine black dignity? In community centers and barbershops, in bodegas and college radio stations, a new kind of debate emerged, not one of left versus right, but truth versus convenience. Elders were challenged by teenagers. Teachers were challenged by students. Fathers were challenged by daughters. One question kept rising like smoke. Does survival in the system prove it works, or prove you're exceptional enough to endure what others can't? And Jasmine? She stayed quiet, not in retreat, but in respect. She didn't book speaking tours. She didn't headline rallies. She let the country talk because the moment was no longer about her voice. It was about the chorus she had freed. Letters poured into her office, thousands, many handwritten, many from people who had never written a politician before. One from a 72-year-old retired steelworker read, "I lived my whole life thinking I had to be grateful just for surviving. But you reminded me survival isn't the same as justice." Another came from a 19-year-old nursing student. "My mother told me to stay quiet in classrooms when race comes up because it's safer. But now I think maybe the safest thing I can do is finally speak." But the letter that Jasmine read last and kept in her coat pocket for weeks came without a return address, folded 4 times, 5 lines only. "I watched you. You didn't flinch. I've flinched my whole life. Now I won't. Thank you. Keep standing." She read it alone, in her office late at night. No cameras, no aides. She folded it slowly and slid it into the same drawer where she had placed the first letter, written weeks earlier by a Jackson State student who told her, "You opened a wound this country stopped treating." They weren't fan mail. They were field notes from a generation waking up. Meanwhile, the movement expanded in shape, not structure. It didn't call for boycotts. It called for new definitions of truth, of leadership, of what it means to be qualified to speak for others. College campuses created new policy around speaker invitations. Nonprofit boards began drafting ethics and representation clauses. Companies revised their diversity guidelines, not just asking who they hired, but why. And Larry Elder? He faded, not from censorship, but from relevance. His podcast numbers collapsed. Conservative networks quietly removed him from panel invites. Former allies referred to him only in the past tense. But what hurt most wasn't the exclusion. It was the absence of deference. The realization that the same audiences who once leaned in when he spoke now looked away. His brand had not been destroyed by scandal. It had been unraveled by clarity, a clarity too many had waited too long to see. Still, Jasmine didn't gloat. She declined an invitation to deliver a TED talk. She refused to headline a Democratic fundraising dinner. When asked by a reporter outside the Capitol if she considered this a victory, she simply said, "Truth doesn't need to win. It just needs to be told, and then it will work on its own." And it did. Weeks later, in a high school gymnasium in Durham, North Carolina, a group of students held an open mic night titled, "What Truth Sounds Like." Dozens of them read poems, letters, spoken word. One girl, no older than 16, stepped up with shaking hands and no paper. She looked straight ahead and said, "I've always wanted to be heard, but I thought being polite mattered more than being real." Jasmine Crockett didn't yell, she didn't scream, but she told the truth. And now I think I can too. The crowd didn't erupt. They stood, every one of them, in silence, hands over hearts, as if bearing witness to something sacred. That was the legacy, not headlines, not applause, a new courage, a new language, a new standard. And Jasmine Crockett, without ever asking for it, had become the axis of that shift. Not because she made noise, but because she named the silence. And once she did, no one could unhear it again. And yet, after the fire faded, after the final headlines cooled, and the last clip stopped circulating, something heavier remained, something that couldn't be undone with a spin, rewritten with a press release, or buried beneath the next scandal. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a scar, a mark left not on the reputation of one man, but on the soul of a nation that had come dangerously close to mistaking charisma for truth, identity for integrity, and silence for peace. Jasmine Crockett hadn't simply exposed a man. She had exposed an illusion, the illusion that proximity to power was the same as principle, and that a polished voice from within the community could speak against its wounds without consequence. What she shattered wasn't just Elder's credibility. It was the lie that success within the system means the system is fair. That's the first lesson. That justice does not come with credentials, that eloquence is not proof of empathy, and that just because someone looks like you, walks like you, or once came from where you came from, does not mean they still carry your truth. Jasmine reminded us that not all betrayal wears the face of the oppressor. Sometimes it wears yours. Sometimes it speaks softly, fluently from behind microphones, with practiced confidence and a smile that looks like progress, but tastes like denial. Sometimes it speaks on stages built for it, because the system always finds new messengers when the old ones lose credibility. The second lesson? Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly. It shrinks into the background, waiting for discomfort to pass. It smiles in the face of accusation. It calls for civility while ignoring harm. Jasmine faced a chamber filled with that kind of power, the kind that hides behind protocol, behind tradition, behind the myth that neutrality is strength. But she didn't play the part she was given. She didn't rise to outrage because she didn't need to. She understood something far more devastating, that facts spoken in calm defiance can crush entire narratives built on inherited comfort. She taught us that truth doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. When she opened that folder, when she called for the video to play, when she dropped that final line, if running from accountability is what we now call leadership, then I'm proud not to be one. She wasn't performing, she was enduring. And that endurance is the third lesson, that justice isn't glamorous, it isn't always victorious, and it almost never feels good when it's happening. It's slow, isolating, punishing. Sometimes you speak the truth and no one claps. Sometimes you win the moral ground and lose everything else. But you say it anyway, because the only thing more dangerous than speaking in a room built to silence you is staying silent. Jasmine faced what so many face in smaller rooms without cameras: the calculated doubt, the weaponized politeness, the practiced dismissal. They didn't question her facts. They questioned her presence, her tone, her right to interrupt a structure that had been designed to let men like elders speak unchallenged. And still she stood, not with fists raised or voice breaking, but with an unshakable posture that said, "I belong here, and I will not flinch." And in that moment, she taught us a fourth lesson, one that goes beyond politics. You don't have to be welcome to be right. You don't have to wait for permission to speak the truth. You don't have to have the final word. You just have to say the one that matters. For millions watching, Jasmine became more than a witness. She became a mirror, a reckoning. She reminded us that not all justice arrives in robes. Sometimes it walks in with no armor except integrity. Sometimes it bleeds. Sometimes it weeps alone in a hotel room after a hearing where the world applauded. But she still felt the burn of being interrupted, diminished, overlooked. That's what justice feels like. It doesn't come wrapped in vindication. It comes cold, quiet, but honest. And maybe the deepest lesson of all is this: when we choose silence to protect comfort, we become co-authors of oppression. Not because we agree with the harm, but because we fear disrupting the room. Jasmine disrupted the room. She made it uncomfortable. And in doing so, she made it honest. In the days after, many wanted to label her hero, destroyer, revolutionary. But none of those titles mattered to her because she wasn't there for a label. She was there for a truth that had been smothered under decades of compromise. You don't need a pulpit to speak truth. You don't need an army to stand for something. You just need to refuse to leave the room when the truth becomes inconvenient. That is the lesson she gave us, not in slogans, but in presence, not in anger, but in unwavering clarity. A reminder that history doesn't remember who shouted loudest. It remembers who refused to be erased. And now when the moment comes for us, whether it's in a boardroom, a school hallway, a family dinner, or a quiet act of resistance with no audience, we will remember how she stood, not because she won, but because she wouldn't kneel to a lie. And that is how justice begins, not with thunder, but with someone who refuses to leave the storm unanswered. And if Jasmine's refusal to flinch taught us how justice begins, then the question now is, who will carry it forward? Because the truth she exposed cannot remain a moment. It must become a movement, lived, practiced, defended, not in hearings but in hallways, not in viral clips, but in voting booths, in school boards, in courtroom benches, in corporate meetings where voices are still measured not by merit, but by the comfort they afford the powerful. If you watched her stand alone and felt something rise inside you, anger, clarity, shame, resolve, then this is your moment too. Not to applaud, but to act. Not to echo her courage, but to multiply it. Because the system won't change because it's wrong. It will change because we force it to. You don't have to be a congresswoman to speak with conviction. You don't need a platform to tell the truth. You need only to decide that silence is no longer your shield. Call out the casual cruelty. Name the systems that pretend to be fair while rewarding denial. Refuse to celebrate voices that rise by stepping on the pain of others. Write, organize, show up. Refuse to look away when power turns its face. Because every time you choose discomfort over complicity, you honor what Jasmine stood for. And every time you don't, the silence grows stronger. This is the moment to shrink the silence. So ask yourself, when the room turns cold and truth becomes the threat, will you look to the exit or will you stay standing? Will you protect the lie or will you become the next voice that makes power tremble? The storm doesn't wait, and neither should you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.